Within a majority of the Middle Ages, there was not much distinction between clothes worn by different rankings and sexes, especially in the earlier centuries. For the most part, the main differences between the high-ranking and low-ranking people's clothing was color, cut, and materials. Although there is not much documentation on the clothing worn before the 10th century, it is generally understood that within the earlier time periods, the clothing was similar to that of the 10th century, but in a more basic form. Women in the 10th century are typically described in manuscripts and ivories as wearing many layers to cover the body. This includes a slip or an underdress, an overdress with a cloak, and some form of wrap or scarf to cover the head. The main dresses worn by women of this century were usually long, sometimes slightly shorter than the underdress, and occasionally trimmed with fur depending on the person's rank. Materials used for clothing varied by one's status and lifestyle. Typically, linen was used by all levels for undergarments. Wool was commonly worn by people of the middle and lower class, as well as for casual wear for the nobility. Cloth made of silks, furs, and satins were seen as more luxurious fabrics worn for special occasions by the upper class people. Peasants in the Middle Ages were generally clothed in long gowns with sleeveless tunics and wimples or headdresses to cover the hair. With this, wool mittens and hats were worn along with sheepskin coats to keep warm and dry in the wet or cold weather. During the 11th century, women again wore linen gowns as an underlayer, now with outer gowns being longer than the floor. These pieces often showed off their figures, with the dresses being laced at the back. Wealth was commonly presented on the clothing of the upper-class women with the jeweled belt or girdles that were fastened tight around the waist. This was provided through improved trade and new cultural influences and advances within medieval Europe. By the later centuries in the High and Late Middle Ages, European fashion started to develop into styles known today. Nearing the 14th century, the fit of articles began changing, having gowns be tighter for stylistic and practical reasons like warmth. Around this time, skirts started being separate from the dress in order to help make them fuller, and bell-shaped sleeves were introduced by adding more width around the cuff. Another interesting advancement developed in the 14th century was the updated clothing terms. Examples of this can be ganache, which is a cape-sleeve long cloak, and houppelande, which is a wide-sleeved, high-collared long robe worn by women in the late 1300s and adopted by men in the 1400s. Along with this, hennins, which are tall cone-shaped hats, often consisting of a veil, were worn by women beginning in the early 1400s. After this time, gowns often developed low V-cut necklines and high waists. Moving forward to men's fashion, it is interesting to note that there is a lot more information documented compared to that of women's fashion.
In the 5th and 6th centuries, men regardless of social rank wore a cloak, tunic, trousers, leggings, and accessories. The cloak was made of animal fur and was designed so that the skin of the animal faced outward and the fur brushed against the undergarments. Tying, lacing, or using a clasp was used to fasten the cloak. The less prosperous wore woolen cloaks. The tunic was made of linen or wool depending on the season. It ended between the hip and the knee and had either long or short sleeves. Multiple tunics were worn at once so that the lower one, often short-sleeved, served as a shirt. A belt or girdle was usually worn with the tunic and might have had a buckle. Trousers were ankle length and had belt loops. Leggings acted as additional protection for the legs. They consisted of woven fabric or leather. The lower classes wore leggings made of ripped or cut cloth from old clothes, blankets, or bags, whereas the upper classes had custom-made leggings. Clothing of the 7th through the 9th centuries was similar to that of previous centuries, although distinctions among the social hierarchy began to become more noticeable through ornamented garments. According to rank, embellishments adorned the collar of the tunic, waist, or border. The trousers in this era were shortened to mid-thigh, and stockings made of leather met them there. Atop the stockings, rounds of cloth, linen, or leather were worn, which started at the ankle and ended just below the knee, in close rolls or crisscrossing each other sandal-wise. Socks began to be worn over the stocking and were banded at the top. Shoes of this era, painted black, had an opening down the instep and were secured with straps. All classes wore them. Common colors for this era consisted of red, blue, and green. Hoods and collars began to appear in the 9th century, and around the same time, the cloak began to be curved by the same belt that was worn over the tunic. Two types of coats were also introduced. The wrap-over coat was knee-length and wrapped over the front of the body. Its sleeves were deep with decorated cuffs, and for the lower classes, they had plainer cuffs. The second kind of coat was a waistcoat, and the more expensive ones were made of fur and the cheaper ones were made of linen. Until the 9th century, the king wore a square crown and a longer cloak. And later in the century, silk began to be worn by both the king and the nobility. In the 9th and 10th centuries, military attire did not differ much from that of civil attire. The only changes were in the form of short linen tunics with metal collars and the addition of a sword, spear, shield, and helmet. Weapons and clothes fittings worn on the battlefield were highly decorated with jewelry techniques. Well-armed Anglo-Saxon soldiers wore wrap-over coats decorated like chainmail with sleeves that narrowed at the wrists, and these were often embroidered with flowers or plants. The belts of commanders were elaborate, wide, and fastened by a narrow strap, which was riveted to the broad belt and passed through a buckle which was much narrower than the belt itself, leaving the end of the belt to hang down. Also attached to the belt were pouches which allowed soldiers to carry their weapons. In the 11th century, shortened tunics became popular, as did shorter hairstyles and beard lengths. Piercings also became fashionable for men, as did golden bracelets. Coifs became popular head coverings and appeared to be flat, round caps. Long stockings with feet attached were also in style. Short boots, those only extending to the ankle, were introduced in the latter part of the century. During this era, soldiers carried either round or crescent-shaped shields, usually painted red. Higher-ranking officials decorated their swords with various colors and insignias. In the middle half of the century, armor began to be made of leather, and weapons were made lightweight. Previous mail tunics, found to be too heavy, preventing the soldier from properly fighting, were replaced by the new leather armor, which consisted of overlapping flaps cut like scales or leaves and each dyed a different color. In the latter half of the century, warriors shaved their heads to resemble the clergy in order to confuse foreign spies. The cowl, which was covered in rings, emerged during this time and was worn under the helmet, which also had a new addition, which was the nosepiece. The ringed knee-length tunic was slit in the front and back to allow for more comfortable riding. The length of the trousers became shorter, and massilled armor began to replace the traditional ringed armory. It included covering the body in rings and removing the sleeves from the tunic. A square pectoral was added to the breast of the armor as added protection and were kilted or covered with rings. A yellow border was added to the pectorals, sleeves, and skirts. Shields had two new adjustments. One strap looped around the arm, while a second strap circled around the neck, allowing the soldier the use of both his hands. The clergy of the 11th century had shaved heads and wore bonnets, which were slightly sinking in the center, with the pendant ornaments of the mitre attached to the side of it. Other garments included the chasuble and the dalmatics. The pastoral staff was generally found to be plain in color and ornamentation. In the 12th century, the tunic was now close-fitting with a long skirt. Peasants wore tunics which were shorter and the sleeves were tubular and rolled back. The tunic could be worn with or without the girdle, which now carried the sword. Necklines were either diagonal from the neck moving across the chest, or horizontal from the neck to the shoulder. Shoes were open over the foot and fastened in front of the ankle with a strap secured by a brooch or buckle. For the wealthy, shoes became decorated. Boots were mid-calf or knee-length and laced down the front or along the inner side. These boots tended to be brightly colored. Shorter boots with pointed toes were also worn and ended just above the ankle. Boots were made of leather from cow or ox, cloth, fish skin, or, for those who could afford it, silk. Accessories for the 12th century English men became more decorated. Wallets and purses in the early half of the century were hung from the girdle or the breech girdle, and in the latter half were placed under the tunic out of sight. Rings, brooches, buckles, and clasps were worn by the ruling classes. Garments were also embroidered during this era. For the first half of the 13th century, linen braids were worn and then shortened to the knee in the second half of the century, which then became undergarments. Short stockings ended just below the knee, and the border was occasionally decorated. Longer stockings, mid-thigh length, could also be worn. The stockings and girdle were tied together at a point in the top front of the stocking by which to keep it in place. Some stockings had stirrups, whole feet, or no feet. For hosiery, made of wool or leather, a thin leather sole was attached so that shoes would not need to be worn. Legwear tended to be brightly colored and stripes were popular. Head accessories in the 13th century included separate hoods which were loose with a pointed cowl and were attached to a robe stretching to the shoulders, the pointed Phrygian cap, a stalked soft cap resembling a beret, coifs which could be worn with other hats or hoods, and travelers wore hats with large brims and low crowns over the hood which tied under the chin. Fidgets resembling modern-day pockets also appeared in this era. Vertical slits were cut in the supertunic, which did not have any side openings, to allow access to purses or keys slung from the girdle of the tunic. Shoes during this era were designed so that each shoe was cut explicitly for an individual's foot. Shoes were plain, and most were closed around the ankle and were laced or buckled along the inner side of the foot. Other shoes exposed the top of the foot and either stretched high behind the ankle or were clasped near the ankle by an instep strap. Boots were briefly colored along the top and had a much looser fit, and were barely extended to the calf. The jippin, also called the pourpoint or doublet, emerged during the 14th century. It replaced the tunic and was knee-length and close-fitting. The jippin was not designed with any folds or gathers as the tunic was. The sleeves were long and tight, and the neck was low. The bodice was padded, and the garment was either buttoned or laced down the front, but for the lower classes it was only buttoned to the waist. The jippin was traditionally worn over a shirt, and if worn with an outer garment, a belt was not worn. At the end of the century, the jippin was shortened to above the mid-thigh and was worn with the belt at hip level. The outer garment of this era was known as the cote hardie and replaced the supertunic of previous centuries. This new, low-necked, knee-length piece was tight-fitting and buttoned or laced down the front to waist level, where it then flared into a full skirt, which was open in the front. A belt or girdle was worn with this new garment. The less fortunate wore looser corde hardies, which did not fasten in the front. Instead, they were one piece and were put on over the head. Men's stockings of the 14th century were lengthened and tied to the jippin so that it was hidden under the skirt. Shorter stockings were tied to garters with stripes of wool or linen. Shorter boots and shoes also became fashionable. Woolen soles were added to shoes, as were straps. Toward the end of the century, men began putting feathers in their hats for decoration.